the growth and stabilization scenario for the third time. I hope you can see my slide. Can everybody see my slide?
Yes.
अच्छा good. अच्छा जी, we've just housekeeping कि माइक्स अपने म्यूट कर दें ताकि वो नॉइस कोई ना आए, स्पीकर्स को पहले बोलने दें, फिर कुछ थोड़े सवाल स्पीकर से मैं कर लूँगा, फिर एवरीबडी कैन आस्क क्वेश्चंस. अब इसमें रेज हैंड्स पता नहीं हो सकता है कि नहीं हो सकता, हम टीम्स पे चले गए जूम से, सो आई एम नॉट श्योर, बट कोशिश करेंगे कि
It can be done. It's
done. So then we'll try and monitor it that way. ठीक है जी. So let's try and have a very good discussion if we can. ठीक है. Oh brilliant. ये भाई माइक किसका ऑन है? माइक बंद कर दो भाई. हाँ. अच्छा. तो अब आगे चलें जी. ये अगर हैशटैग आपने यूज करना है तो PID IMF यूज करें. हैशटैग PID IMF ट्विटर के लिए. It would be nice to have a Twitter discussion. I'm just coming out of a discussion from Monash universities, and I must say it was very well attended. 200 people and lots of discussion. So let's hope we can. Okay, now let's see. So today we've got two eminent speakers, two former finance ministers, Dr. Hafiz Pasha, who is a well-known figure. I don't have to introduce him. Former finance minister, done many things, including the UN, including teaching, a dedicated researcher, dedicated teacher. So Hafiz Pasha always has interesting things to say, so I thought we should definitely get him on. We've heard Adnan Mazrai and Masood. We've heard the IMF side. Now let's hear the Pakistani side. We've also got Dr. Salman Shah, another well-known figure, also a former finance minister, now advising the chief minister, and also is a well-known academic economist, has been around for a while, and I don't think needs any introduction, has been in many committees, many places. Okay. So that's the introduction. I just want to repeat these slides so that we should all remember them. IMF has been, we have been in the IMF emergency ward. IMF has been looking after us, the baby of Pakistan, changing our diapers, feeding us, etc., for the last 5 decades or 6 decades. There has not been a decade when we haven't had 2 or 3 IMF programs. That really puts us in a special category. No country has been in IMF for so long. So I really want to keep repeating this slide so that you people don't forget. We have very short memories in Pakistan. Okay. Shah Sahab kya keh rahe hain? Ji Shah Sahab.
शुरू नहीं किया यार.
शुरू कर दिया यार. Aren't you on?
No.
Hey. अच्छा. एक second. यार, I'm sorry, I have to get Shah Sahab on. भाई मंसूर साहब शाह साहब को लेके आए, सलमान शाह साहब को. वो नहीं आए अभी तक. क्या हुआ है? कह रहे हैं can't get on. मंसूर साहब.
सर सलमान शाह साहब का सर मेरे पास नंबर नहीं, काइंडली मुझे भेज दें, मैं उनसे कांटेक्ट करूं.
मंसूर मैं आपको शेयर कर रहा हूं.
शेयर करो प्लीज यार. ठीक है, मैं उतनी देर ये कंटिन्यू करता हूं. ठीक है जी. ओके, सो दिस इज इट. नाउ पाशा साहब, आई होप सलमान शाह joins us soon. We've got the prolonged use report, which I'm sure you've seen in 2002, which acknowledged that there were design failures, there were implementation failures, and it talked about institutional decay. Since then, we all know the Greek story of austerity, and I've been reading Varoufakis's book, which is really, really enlightening, how a local economist can take on the international establishment, and did very well. Unfortunately, we have not done that. Okay. Now the question is, where do we have the capacity to negotiate, etc., and where do we have FPR, MOF planning? ये करते क्या है? Where is the tax policy? तो ये मैं छोड़ देता हूँ बातें. But ये अगर लास्ट प्रोग्राम को देख लें, लास्ट प्रोग्राम हम सबको पता है, सारा वेवर्स से चला. हम सबको पता है कि exchange rate appreciated. PID has put out a knowledge brief today on the 5 currency crises of Pakistan and how we goofed up. Each of those crises was our problem. Last program was also made up of loss of reserves with a debt build-up. Last program was also had a durability of 3 months. Circular debt was not removed. So are we going to achieve a durable adjustment or not? These things I'm repeating every webinar because I think it's important to bear them. Meanwhile, our long-run growth has gone down. Meanwhile, our long-run growth has gone down. We have, you can see volatile and long-run growth declining. Our investment GDP ratio is also declining, and it's the lowest in Asia. You can see that, right? So what are we doing? And this is where I want to bring the speakers in. We've got a huge problem. We've got tax and documentation costs that we did 2 webinars, one with the investors and one with the businesses, 3 in fact, retail. All of them are complaining about the tax and documentation cost. Combined tax and documentation costs on businesses, we're going to estimate it, is probably about 40–50%, which is killing the economy. Fiscal deficit still remains high. What have we achieved in our programs? I think all we've got is austerity. So I'll leave it there and I'll bring the speakers in. Hafiz Pasha, can you please go ahead? You've got, you know, 10 minutes to try and make this happen. Pasha Sahab.
Bismillah, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you well.
Okay. Thank you for this invitation. What I'd like to do is, in the 2 minutes, set up a kind of a framework of analysis that we had developed. And then, of course, in the question and answer session, we can discuss each of these in some detail.
Sure.
The first is that we do have now a macroeconomic framework that has been presented recently by the IMF as part of the rapid financing facility that Pakistan was able to access very quickly of $1.4 billion. It is very important that we have a look at this particular macroeconomic framework, which takes us from 1920 to 24-25. So it has a full 5-year framework in it. And to me, one of the fundamental questions at this point in time is the feasibility of this strategy. The second question or second issue that we cannot possibly ignore, although we are taking a somewhat longer perspective, is what are likely to be the initial conditions, if I can call them that, at the end, inshallah, whenever COVID-19 stops having an impact. So that is very important, and some work which PIDE has done, and we had also done some work earlier. You know, the kind of initial conditions we may be talking of could be an unemployment rate, as per the PIDE estimate, of almost 33%, and incidence of poverty of almost 50%. So given this, the question is, how do we move on to a stable, long-run path from an extraordinarily difficult set of short-run initial conditions? So we need to focus on what's likely to be possible in the next year or two in terms of ensuring some process of revival. To me, some of the key prongs of a long-term strategy for managing growth with stabilization, and we can, of course, discuss each of them in some detail. The first, to me, is the whole area of progressive taxation reforms, which has remained elusive. Last year, an effort was made to broaden the tax base and remove some tax expenditures, but the end result, unfortunately, even prior to Corona, we were only able to achieve virtually less than half the initial growth rate that was anticipated. The other very important area to me, and this is very much embedded in the macroeconomic framework that has been presented by the IMF, is rationalizing the size of government. And here we get into a somewhat complex area. Among other things, if you look at the non-debt servicing component of current expenditure, which is where a lot of us perceive there is a certain amount of fat, particularly at the federal level, the issue is how do we rationalize the size, particularly of the federal government following the 18th Amendment. And in particular, the fund has suggested a downward slide in the level of defense spending over the next 5 years. Will we be in a position realistically, given the regional context, to be able to do this? The third area to me in terms of the impact, particularly in terms of accelerating the process of growth, is change in expenditure priorities. It is truly tragic that Pakistan's development spending at a time when we need particularly to focus on water resources development, has sharply dwindled and virtually down to half the level in terms of the percentage of the GDP as it used to be, say, over a decade or more ago. How do we ensure more effective development spending, which creates a stronger multiplier? And how do we ensure that some of the critical bottlenecks that are emerging, like, for example, we are moving from being a water stress to a truly water short economy, how do we ensure enough financing of these top priority areas, which otherwise will exercise severe constraints on our growth potential? The next and perhaps equally critical area is export-led growth. I mean, it is absolutely clear that Pakistan has been a really, unfortunately, a big failure in terms of promoting its exports. And it's really quite surprising, isn't it, that over the last 7 to 8 years, our exports in dollar terms have virtually remained unchanged. How do we accelerate exports? How do we diversify our exports beyond the traditional dependence on low value added textiles? How can we, in that sense, ensure that we are able to achieve a measure of balance in our current account without having to artificially restrict imports beyond what we have already done, such that our balance of payments begins to look somewhat more stable and sustainable? And finally, in terms of the individual, the planning process and the strategy, it is extremely important that we identify some key sectors, perhaps like construction, agriculture, and so on, which have strong backward and forward linkages and are promote a measure of inclusiveness in the growth process. These are, to me, some of the key issues which we need to focus on in terms of arriving at a long-term strategy for managing the process of growth, achieving a higher growth rate. The PIDE is talking of a growth rate of 8%. We are long-term average is below 4%. How do we manage to combine stabilization with a manageable public debt and international reserves at a sustainable, reasonably high level? This is, to me, an extremely difficult subject, and it has been made even more difficult by the conditions that have been created by the COVID-19. Thank you very much.
Much. Is Salman Shah on? Can I don't think Shah Sahab has been able to get on. Okay, while we sort that out, let me ask you the first question, Hafiz. Is Salman Shah on? Can I? I don't think so, huh? Okay, Hafiz, then let me ask you my first question, and we'll wait till Salman Shah gets on. The program design, Hafiz, you quoted the IMF macro framework, and that's very nice, very good. But tell me, do we ever prepare a macro framework, or do we just live on the IMF macro framework? The second and related question to that is, you and I have both seen so many programs. The program design roughly remains the same. Should the program design remain the same, or should we change the program design? If so, how? And then the related question is, our programs are all based on austerity. How do we get out of that? So your critique on program design, and as well as how do we prepare our own macro framework, or should we live with the IMF macro framework? Go ahead, Hafiz.
Okay. There used to be a time, and you've been a deputy chairman of the Planning Commission, so have I. Mm-hmm. And there was a time way back in our history, which came to an end definitely in the early 90s, when we did have some kind of a discipline around a 5-year plan. Mm-hmm. And this used to provide a kind of a macroeconomic framework around which the entire policy mix and the implementation strategy was developed. That has ceased to exist. Mm-hmm. Usually what we do is we have the macroeconomic framework given to us by the fund program at a time when there is a fund program, which is quite frequent, as you rightly identified. But what we are expected to do as per law, requirements as per the various, now recently we have the Public Financial Management Act. Earlier on, we had the Fiscal Responsibility and Debt Management Act. The requirement is to have, at the time of presentation of the budget, a medium-term budgetary framework. And that emerges from presumably a macroeconomic framework. Clearly, because the link has to be in terms of the growth in the tax bases and so on. So there is, in fact, if you look at the last year's budget documents and look at budget in brief, towards the fag end, you will see a medium-term budgetary framework. The problem is, as always, Ministry of Finance engages in an exercise in extreme optimism and does not operationalize or even begin to state how some of these targets could begin to be achieved. So it's just merely a few numbers, and there is no sense of the strategy underlying this. And this is the tragedy. We don't operationalize the framework or even the medium-term budgetary framework. So my own sense is that we need much more content. For example, the fund, even with these initial conditions created by COVID, expects us next year to raise the tax to GDP ratio from a maximum of 11% of the GDP this year, even that is a bit optimistic now, to something like 13.3% of the GDP next year. It has been very sensible in terms of saying that the GDP growth rate will be at the maximum 2%, which is actually quite optimistic at this point in time, because the current quarter's GDP growth, according to the implied by the estimates for the year of minus 0.4% for 2019-20, implied that the GDP growth rate in the last quarter is at least minus 9%. So we are starting with an initial condition of -9. It could get worse if COVID lasts longer. How do we begin to achieve 2%? So I don't want to get too caught up in the short run, but the short run is what will influence the long run. So the question is, can the fund begin to discuss and operationalize in meaningful terms an effort at raising the tax to GDP ratio of Pakistan by 2.3% of the GDP at a time when the economy, at least initially, will be going through a process of negative growth? And then how does it expect thereafter for the GDP, tax to GDP ratio to rise by another roughly 2% of the GDP? These are serious questions. See, the feasibility of even a fund's macroeconomic framework begins to look infeasible. So there are other areas also where I have some serious question marks, but I'd like to think that perhaps the most critical element in a strategy is mobilization of resources to lifelines, revenues, and exports. To me, this is what will constitute a successful medium to long run strategy if we can begin to achieve higher levels of revenues and exports. On the revenue side, I do have a few ideas which I'd be happy to discuss later on after the detailed questions.
We'll get there, yeah. Salman Shah is here. So Shah Sahab, let me clue you in a little bit on what we are doing and you can respond there. Hafiz Pasha has given us a very nice introduction to our problem with growth and stabilization. He's outlined what the macro framework should be. He's outlined what the growth possibilities are. He's also talked about program design. And the last question that I raised with him was on program design, and you can take it from there, that our program design remains much the same. We are focused on austerity. We really don't seem to have a macro framework. We rely on the fund. There used to be a time, as Pasha says, that the Planning Commission used to prepare macro framework. Now, the macro framework is hidden somewhere in the Ministry of Finance. I'm not even sure, and I'd like you to comment on that. Should the Ministry of Finance prepare the medium-term budget? In other countries, it is considered that it should be placed in another agency, because we need to have different agencies doing different things. If you recall from the old Tinbergen problem, if we let one agency do everything, then we create a problem. So Shah Sahab, can you please respond to the issue of program design and sort of topic of the seminar? Go ahead. Salman Shah, unmute your mic and go ahead.
Hello, Nadeem, can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Nadeem sir, अपना mic unmute कर लें, sir. Sir, we can hear you, sir.
Yeah, we can hear you. Go ahead.
पहली बात तो ये है कि I think the world has been turned upside down, and I think
Shah
to
Sahab,
talk
stay
about
English.
if we look at the situation, the current situation, the world has been turned upside down from a stabilization program where you were worried about the twin deficits and the balance of payment crisis and all those kinds of things. I think that situation has almost turned upside down because now the situation is a totally compressed production and income, compressed demand, lower consumption, disruption of production, disruption of supply chains. The whole economy is in a downward spiral. So I think to talk about stabilization at this point in time in the old framework is totally, I think, not the right way of going about it. The first thing is really how do you take care of the 30 to 40 million people who are out of work now, who are dependent on a handout just for their survival. How will we put our workplace back into operation, and how long will it take, and what kind of strategy the government will have to follow to be able to get this back on track. So I think in this kind of situation, to think of even an austerity kind of an approach to whole thing doesn't make sense. So I think the first thing would be to is there a way where we can actually the stimulus which we are providing so far, how can we intensify it in other ways? How can we move from a situation where the central bank was tracking inflation and monetary tightening to a situation where you are going to be looking at how many jobs can we save, and how will we be able to maintain employment, and in a situation where inflation is not going to be a factor. Inflation is actually, they may turn into a deflation. How do we operate in a world where the global trade has been totally disrupted? How do we deal with the situation where our overseas remittances are going to fall quite dramatically? So I think these issues are really the issues which the government should be looking at, and we have to come up with policies where we can to some extent mitigate these effects. So we have to have a very counter-cyclical kind of economic strategy. And I think for the first time in almost 100 years, economists in our part of the world have started talking about supply chains and how to manage the supply chains and how to ensure that supply chains are not disrupted. And I think that's where we really need to focus in a way that we not only are able to maintain the supply chains, but for the first time also look at how efficient are our supply chains, and how can we improve the productivity and competitiveness of our supply chains so that these supply chains can be turned into value chains domestically and internationally. So there will be lots of opportunities also in this COVID environment. And those are the opportunities where we'll have to look into and how do we do lots of import substitution, which is going to happen. There's a lot of disruption, but there's a lot of opportunity over there. Also in the regional context, there may be even exports into China might be possible. We have our agriculture sector, which is not that badly affected at the moment, but our agriculture sector has never performed very well in the last so many years. So this might be the time to actually stop worrying about our current account deficits or our fiscal deficits and our other traditional mode of thinking, and focus on how do we do the reforms, how do we rejuvenate our supply chains, and how do we ensure that the economy does not collapse in the coming months. So I think that is a much bigger problem to deal with. And unfortunately, our mindsets are really not geared towards that situation. Our mindset still in the Ministry of Finance is towards austerity, as you rightly said. We are still talking about increasing our taxes when there is hardly any economic activity. In a dwindling economic activity environment, to talk about improving our revenues is not really very rational to do at this point in time. And at the end of the day, we may have to incur a lot more debt. We'll have to have a lot bigger fiscal deficit. We may have to renegotiate our loans. Debt restructuring is probably not, we'll have to do it because I don't think we'll be able to service our international debt. Of course, our domestic debt is something which we can
increase. So, Shahji, you are recommending a very highly supply side policy, which I agree, and I certainly think is a very good idea. But let me raise the next.
I think one point I would add is that our banking sector is not really stepping up to the plate, and they have to move up. I mean, they have plenty of liquidity. This is the time when the banking sector should be gearing up for many different areas of infrastructure finance, of housing finance, SME finance, all kinds of sectors which were choked of financing. Those sectors will become very important because unless we have a very massive infrastructure program, I don't think we will be able to get our economy back on track.
Okay, thanks. Shahji, I think that's very, very well put. I agree with you, certainly. We're going to do a banking webinar in the next week, inshallah. We'll call you guys again. But let me just say, your supply side policies I agree with, and I think they're good policies. My only problem is we're in the middle of fund program. And the fund program ain't going nowhere. And unfortunately, we will have to deal with the fund, probably already dealing with the fund, because the next budget will be prepared in negotiation with the fund, and the program will have to be lived with, because in these difficult times, what else can we do? So I will still remain on the program design for a few minutes, if you'll give me a moment. And I would urge both of you to give me very concise, clear answers. Pasha, all our programs are tax-led. And I know you just said that you want to talk about taxes. So let me just say, we are a tax-led economy. Growth is secondary to our concerns for the last, I think, since 1980, if I look at the programs, they've all wanted one objective: increase revenue, increase revenue, increase. Growth was always a residual. And in order to increase revenues, we put tax upon tax upon tax upon tax, withholding tax after withholding tax, presumptive tax after presumptive tax, full and final taxes, whatever you call them. I mean, we've got tons of these taxes. I think the tax ledger is so bloody complicated, one can't even follow. But related to the tax, there's a huge documentation cost now. People tell me that they are employing 4 or 5 economists to accountants to just try and keep up with the documentation. And it's combined documentation and taxes, I think, amount to now 50 or 60% of companies' expenses. Plus, we have mini budgets. We have a mini budget every quarter. So people can't trust even the tax regime. It keeps changing all the time, and they will grab wherever they like. Really, I think this is a Sheriff of Nottingham policy. Is that the way we should run our program? Should it be tax-led? Should it have this strange tax policy? Should growth be a residual? Pasha Saab, you go first.
Okay, this is perhaps the single most important question in the context of the current design of the fund program, which relies very, very heavily on a big increase in the tax to GDP ratio, which then provides the resources for expansion, particularly in development spending, and thereby accelerates the process of growth. I mean, that essentially is in some ways the strategy implicit in the framework that has been presented historically and certainly also this time by the fund. I've already mentioned that even with this COVID conditions, we are expected, according to this framework, to raise a tax to GDP ratio by 2.3% of the GDP in 1 year, next year. Allow me to stray a little bit into the realm of political economy. The issue is that today, Pakistan, and this has certainly for the first time perhaps been projected by the report on the sugar industry crisis and the price increases which took place. The problem is that our tax system has been captured. And if you don't mind, I hope you'll allow me to use this word, captured. I'll give you a very significant example of this. 1997, when I was still in the government, we brought in a law on agricultural income taxation. And the Musharraf government carried on with it and in fact developed it and came up with a second generation of law. But to this day, you will probably already know that our total revenues from agricultural income tax, which is roughly 20% of the national economy, is a magnificent rupees 2 billion. 2 billion. And compared to that, the rest of the economy is contributing about 1,400 billion rupees. This is one example of a tax which just has not developed. And the time has come now for some kind of an effort in terms of developing this. The other perhaps dramatic example, which if you allow me to present, just to show the extent to which our system has, in a sense, had to cater to the needs of particular very powerful groups in society. The whole regime of property taxation. One simple example, the city of Mumbai alone in property tax collects 5 times as much as Pakistan collects nationally in its property tax. I can spend the rest of the day telling you where the gaps are, and I won't do that. But some of my students and I, we have been doing some research on this, the design and the way the system has been oriented. So this whole issue of documentation has been exaggerated. Yes, there is a problem. We talk about the traders, but do we know that, for example, the importers are the highest source of income tax revenue in Pakistan? Do we know that? That is a fact. The highest revenue from presumptive taxes is from imports, and that's part of trade. The question is, do we have the political if you like, the will as a nation to begin to tackle these areas of special privilege. If not, then your tax to GDP ratio will remain hostage and will not increase beyond the current 11% or so. So my submission is that we need to focus on some deep structural tax reforms. And I can, as I told you, I can spend the rest of the morning telling you what they are, but I won't do that. I just want to make the broad point that this issue of political economy of tax reforms is very important, and someday or the other we will have to confront it.
Fair point. Shahzab, tell me, can we get more taxes out of growth, or should we just focus on the current taxes?
Well, Nadeem, I think we are trying to beat this donkey for so many years, and the FDR has never been able to deliver. And to think that FDR is going to deliver without some very massive restructuring of the body, or to come up with an entirely new system, we can't rely on it. Whether we like it or not, there is not going to be any revenue generation. Whether we like it or not, development is going to be cut to the bone. And the current expenditures will continue to expand. So the situation is this, that if we don't do any development work, all the country will really be unemployed, because right now almost 30 million people are out of job, particularly in the services sector. And unless you have a very major infrastructure spending program which goes into every district of Pakistan, I think we are going in for a very tough time for our people. So I would say that we need to find alternate ways of financing infrastructure. Public-private partnerships we have talked about for such a long time, but we have never really focused on them because the bureaucracy loves to tax and spend. They love to be able to do the PSDP program or the annual development programs, and they would not really venture into public-private partnerships or tap into the capital markets, etc. So I think that there has to be a paradigm shift in how we manage the economy. And growth, I agree with you, is the critical thing. It's not only, at this point in time, just sustaining your current level is going to be very, very difficult. And to think that you are going to have 8% growth or 10% growth in the same model is not possible. So I think we have to really now start thinking in a very radical fashion, in a very different fashion. We have to rely a lot more on the capital markets, because that's where the money is. That's where, if we can have the right kinds of instruments and the right kinds of frameworks, we will be able to invest. The issue is that historically we have been always under investing in public infrastructure, in our cities, in our communication, in everything. And it's primarily the way we control everything. So we have not allowed the markets to function. Everything is designed by.
You've given me a very good way to segue into my next question, which is that, can we have a program led by growth? As I said, I've been reading Varoufakis's book, and he argued very strongly against the EU, lost the argument, but he's written a lovely piece saying that Greece program has to be led by growth and not by austerity. And I think that's something we should think about. Can we, Pasha, have a program led by growth? As you said, both of you have said that infrastructure is important, but I would argue that our investment rate has always been around 15%. So if you take out the public sector investment, our private sector investment has roughly been about 10 or 11%, right? 10 or 11% is just replacement cost. We ourselves have not seen much private sector investment. The investment has been mainly in some, vague sectors. For example, schooling, there was a bit of investment, but really it was not significant. Mobile phones, there's been some investment, but we've seen really no new projects come up. Private investment is holding back. Is that not something we should consider? Should it be public sector investment-led growth? So just give me, Pasha, design a growth-led program for me. How can we have a growth-led program and not a tax-led program?
Okay, a good question. And I wish someday we would have the flexibility to be able to go ahead with implementing such a strategy. It, of course, is a high-risk strategy, but nevertheless, given the fact that old strategies have all failed, the time probably has come to try this a kind of a reverse process whereby growth induces expansion in the tax base and in a way self-finances growth. That is a way perhaps that we can begin to think. Now, let me identify 2 or 3 particular areas where I see significant gains from pursuing a somewhat growth-led strategy. The first is the construction sector. And here I'm not talking only about infrastructure, which both Salman and I have emphasized, particularly now in the context of development of the water resources sector and so on, but also private construction. Now, the government has taken a major step forward by providing a whole range of supply, I'll call them that, incentives to the construction sector recently, including a tax amnesty, tax virtual free environment, and so on. But the problem lies on the demand side. What will the builders be constructing if there is no demand for housing in the country at this point in time? Surely, if you want to pursue a growth-led strategy, you have to now focus the banking system on developing housing finance. Tell me, today, housing finance is 0.6% of total credit given by the banking system of Pakistan, and mostly to their own employees. Why can we not have developed a proper foreclosure legal framework? Why can we not have, at least for relatively low-cost housing, relatively long-term low-interest rate policy? Were we to do this, you see, the construction sector, as the government has rightly identified, has huge linkages and could become one of the focal points for a growth strategy, both public and private construction. But clearly, nothing's being done on the demand side. The other area is, of course, the incredible innovativeness and dynamism, which in its own quiet, unobserved way, our SME sector has been contributing to Pakistan. The tragedy is that this sector also has been hopelessly starved for credit. And Salman rightly identified that the banking system has not responded. Despite the financing package offered by the State Bank through the banking system of low interest rates for covering the costs of wages and salaries of employees and deferment of the loan repayment. Tell me, why is it that in the last 6 weeks, private sector credit from the banking system has contracted, not increased, by 44 billion rupees? Not perhaps a single SME has been given access. You have specific human capital in craftsmanship, in the quality of work that is done in surgical instruments, in sports goods, and so on and so forth. If these units die, we will be the permanent losers of a significant part of our export base. Can we not develop a radical new financing strategy? Can we not have credit guarantees? Can we not have a fiscal subsidy built into the coverage of any degree of non-performing loans? Can we not do innovative things to access the SME sector? Third area, finally, whether we like it or not, agriculture continues to be, in a sense, a very important sector in our economy. Look what we have done to cotton. I mean, there was a time when I was a young professor at the University of Karachi, I used to proudly say 1 billion bales of cotton more, 1% growth more. It may now be 0.4% growth more, but it's significant. Why have we replaced cotton with sugarcane? Why was the decision recently? I had consistently provided for years a basic support price to cotton. Why was that withdrawn and instead focus on giving a sugarcane support price? These are some of these basic decisions which are growth inducing in nature. We are importing 4 to 5 million bales of cotton, a country which was once considered a one product economy. So there are clearly many areas. And again, there is this whole business, unfortunately, of state capture. Vested interests coming in, and the sugar report has clearly highlighted how this happened in one sector at least. There is clearly scope for developing a growth-led strategy, extremely innovative in character, and ensuring simultaneously that while it happens, it can continue to provide sustainable financing mechanism, both in terms of tax revenues and exports. I would be extremely, extremely excited if we begin to think in this.
So Shah Saab, can you tell us why the finance ministry never thinks of a growth-led strategy, and what would your growth-led reform be? If you had to design a program, negotiate with the IMF, what would you put down as a growth-led framework?
Well, I think, Nadeem, you have hit the nail on the head. For a country like Pakistan, where you have a huge youth bulge, and probably we are the youngest country in the world, and we would have under 25 years age, we are probably 60% of our population. And for them, its growth is the only option. There's no other option. So if we had focused on the growth-led kind of economic strategy and policies, our entire setup would be different. Our organizational schemes, our departments, the way we are organized. I mean, if you look at it, for the first time, as I mentioned, we are focusing on the supply chains. All the provincial governments have absolutely no knowledge of what is a supply chain. They have your favorite district management group is there to manage administratively and maybe from a revenue collection point of view, but they have never looked at a district as a source of economic development or economic growth and the economic potential. Now, if you look at our urban areas, almost 40% of our population resides in the urban area. And sometimes I think, what are they doing? What economic activity is taking place in our mega cities where half the population, which is the women population, they are in their homes and not really working. The other half is, doing some very marginal kind of economic activity. Whereas even in Bangladesh, you see that even their downtowns are full of workshops and factories and small businesses, and their economy seems to be working very well. So they just took one supply chain and developed it into a global chain. In Pakistan, we have not yet developed a global value chain. Even in the textile sector, as Hafiz was just mentioning, we really crushed it. If we had an opportunity to really develop it, we did everything possible to stamp it and to crush it, to stop it, to move to something else. So I think a growth-led strategy is the need for Pakistan. And I think if we are going to look at the COVID-19, post-COVID-19 environment, I think we have to focus on growth. And we have to focus on our supply chains. We have to focus on our people and try to understand what they are doing. How do we facilitate them to do everything? How do we facilitate our cities? How do we be a catalyst for growth rather than trying to, put them into a straitjacket and focus it on a very nebulous kind of stabilization programs.
You've summed it up very well. Let me also tell both of you, Pasha, Shah Sahab, let me tell both of you. Masood Ahmed and Adnan Mazrai both agreed that Pakistan should have a growth-led strategy. And they were both surprised why the Pakistan government did not and does not propose a growth-led strategy. They say that the IMF is looking for it, and their conclusion, Masood's conclusion, Pasha, was that Pakistan does not want growth. So now I come to my next question, which is kind of related. Each program has a line somewhere in there saying structural reform, which they don't define. And we keep talking structural reform, we never define it. One of the things that I see, for example, structural reform where it's necessary is the power sector, where we've lost, I think, 3 trillion rupees in all, I think, cumulated over the last 12 years, which is a huge amount of money, not a small amount of money. So can you guys please give me now, in this strategy that you're proposing, what should the structural reform be? What are the 2 or 3 key structural reforms that you would want? Pasha Sahab?
Yes, I've already referred to you on the political economy of the tax reform process. I can give you a ballpark estimate, which we have come after an enormous amount of research on the laws, both income tax, sales tax, and others, and the provincial laws, and how they are being used, and what kind of special provisions have been built into these laws to provide some privileges. A ballpark estimate at this point is that the tax expenditures, if I can use a less harmful expression, the government reports them at just above, say, 1 to 1.5% of the GDP. They are actually in the range of 4 to 5% of the GDP, and even more perhaps. And if we include other mechanisms like access to land, preferential, input and output pricing, some of which we saw recently in the sugar thing, and other mechanisms, then you will begin to see how much of the resources are being appropriated. That is one key area of structural reforms, but the big question mark is it politically feasible to even begin to think like this? Okay, now you come to the power sector. Why is it that we cannot very simply decide once and for all that the merit order of plants will be preserved, honored, which will ensure that the newly commissioned, more efficient LNG and other plants begin to become more usable than some of these ancient Genco and other plants? Why do we need to protect employment down there at the lower end of the merit order? We have to take a big decision on this. The other is we have discos down to sub-provincial levels. We have 9 to 10 discos in the country. Why cannot we introduce a measure of competition among these discos? Some of the discos have loss ratios which are vastly smaller than the loss ratios of other discos. There are 1 or 2 discos whose billing recovery rates are approaching almost 99 to 100%. In other cases, they're down to 60 to 70%. How can we build a market for power? I'm sorry to be pro-market here, but frankly, the cushioning, the pricing, the NEPRA's rules of pricing, cost plus pricing, and so on and so forth, have wreaked havoc on our power sector. Why can we not allow freewheeling? You know, these are some of the fundamental steps that need to be taken, because quite frankly, the power sector's problems have reached a dimension that they are beginning to be a limiting source to growth. I mean, the financial liability, which is very casually mentioned in the budget documents and nobody ever talks about them. We have a head in grants called contingent liabilities. That's it. The amount is 400 billion rupees. What are these contingent liabilities? These are guaranteed debt which PSEs have taken and are unable to repay. So we need to know what the position is. What is the accountability of this process? One single item, one line item. Even we get in more detail now on defense than we get on these contingent liabilities. So for God's sake, there has to be much more transparency, accountability in the process. We have to induce a degree of pressure, and the whole pricing mechanism in the power sector has to be thoroughly re-examined. We cannot sustain a sector where the transmission losses are in the region of 17 to 18%, and the billing losses aggregate terms are about 10 to 12%. It's just not viable. So for God's sake, and I like this idea of a growth strategy, if it opens up the possibility of really engaging in creative thinking for meaningful structural change. Thank you.
Shaji, tell me, this business of 17% power sector losses, this business of 10% non-payment of bills, this business of SROs or tax expenditures running at about 4 or 5% of GDP, this business of government appropriation of giving away plots free or whatever, these kinds of things. Shaji, Pasha Sahab, these things have been there since we were young boys. I wouldn't even say men. And today, I don't think we are spring chickens, and they still remain there. So, Shaji, can you give us a design of your structural program? If we are negotiating,
I think,
what would you put there?
Nadeem, number one, I think the power sector is holding us hostage, and it is a sunk cost. To my mind, the power sector is a sunk cost, and the government's effort to retrieve that sunk cost is damaging us further. So I think if we look at the situation, we never developed a power market, even though in 1991, the power strategy mentions that the unbundling of WAPDA is going to end up into a power market. And now, 30 years later, we still don't have a power market. We still have the DISCOs, which are monopolies. We still have not been able to do wheeling in the right sense. We have not split up the DISCOs into power supply companies and the distribution companies. So we have not done the work which was needed, and now time has overtaken us. And with solar coming in at about 2 to 3 cents, I think everything else is obsolete now. And our villages, our towns, our cities, our people, they can be independent of the grid. I mean, there is no reason why we should be on the grid. And the only reason is that we are trying to save the billions which were poured in and the billions which were kind of had kickbacks and all that. And that system is choking our economy. So my mind, power sector is really, we open it up. Even if we have to pay the capacity charges, we can shut down these thermal power plants, gradually phase them out, bring in the renewable source, which is solar, which is abundantly available everywhere in Pakistan, and which gets rid of the grid also. So I think we need to move into the 21st century in that respect. Similarly, I think we need to go into a growth strategy with very specific kind of objectives in terms of how we can create and the jobs which our people can do it, and it has to be done very smoothly and very effectively. And the private sector has to be enabled, and the competition has to be there. Really, I think we need to let the market economy establish a market economy. Since the fall of Berlin Wall, if the world has transformed itself, Pakistan has not transformed itself. You saw the 90s, we never did any structural reforms. Then we had the last 10, 20 years, we have not done the kind of reforms which are needed. Everything is controlled by the government. You look at our sugars thing, you look at the flour thing. Agriculture is not, agriculture markets are highly inefficient. And our productivities are 1/5 of the world. And I think we can't even supply good seed to the farmer. The seed market is not there. The implement market is not there. The water market is not there. So, and then we think that we are a very capitalistic kind of a society and we need to become a bit more socialist. But really, we have never really created a market economy. And Pakistan needs deregulation. I would say the thing which we would need right now is reforms. Reform the value chains, deregulate the economy, let the investment-driven growth, let it come in. I mean, our investment ratios are abysmal. I mean, there's hardly any investment in the country.
So basically, regulation is the most important thing that you're recommending, and I buy that. I think that's a very good idea. Unfortunately, we have not mainstreamed deregulation into our debate. And Shaji, I think you have put it very well. We need markets in this country. Let me turn to another question, which is also extremely important. Pasha Saab, can you please tell me, IMF fixes an inflation target of 2 to 5%. We all know the Phillips curve. There is a trade-off between growth and inflation. We've just published something on the sacrifice ratio in the PIDE. We find that the sacrifice ratio, though not too large, but not negligible either. There is a sacrifice ratio for going to a low growth rate. Should we target a 2 to 5% growth inflation regardless of growth, or is there a growth inflation trade-off and we can live with a higher rate of inflation and therefore, get a better growth? Related to this is the question of central bank independence. IMF wants central bank independence, including the tenure for the governor. What about growth? Who speaks for growth in our government? I find there's nobody who speaks for growth in our government. We only have an anti-inflation economy, and therefore we are being crushed. What are your thoughts on that? Do we need somebody to speak for growth? Do we need a higher inflation target? Do we need to choke off growth through real interest rates that are sky high? Pasha Saab?
Good question. There was a time when Pakistan, in fact, was perhaps excessively growth-oriented, and I'm talking about the era of the 60s. And there was a time when the Planning Commission used to be the dominant agency, and the deputy chairman used to play a leading role in the planning process in terms of the growth strategy and the kind of incentives and institutional arrangements that need to be put in place. But some or the other, we got bogged down later on because of the inequality which resulted from this unmanaged growth process. The issue is that I've had the good fortune of serving in all three economic ministries: commerce, planning, and finance. And of course, my favorite ministry has always been planning. The point is that in finance, much of the time is in managing short-term problems and trying to somehow or the other avoid or prevent crises from emerging in a short-term basis. There is absolutely no room, no motivation thereof for medium to long-term thinking. There is therefore a need for a balance, and you will be surprised to know that in the 90s, the leading party in the negotiations with the IMF used to be the Planning Commission, and the macroeconomic framework used to be built through the chief economist of the Planning Commission. So I'm afraid there is a need for some reallocation of responsibilities and powers within the governmental structure. Hopefully that will lead to some concern for growth on a more medium and long-term basis. Now, coming to one or two other issues, if you allow me, One other dimension of growth, which has somewhat longer perspective, but nevertheless extremely important, is this country's lack of concern for human development. It is indeed a tragedy that even in the whole of South Asia, compared to countries like even Nepal and so on, Pakistan, of course, compared to Bangladesh and so on, has a significantly lower level of human development. And unless you have a trained labor force and you have a semblance of technology and innovation, where are we going to get productivity gains which contribute to growth? So in my mind, the priority has to be also towards a very, very well thought out strategy of human development linked to absorption of youth and enhancement in labor productivity. Now, unfortunately, Pakistan spends very little on human development. And what I'm actually pleased about the current program, for the first time in history, the IMF has recognized that there is such a thing as human development. And one of the indicative targets in our present program is the floor on spending on human development. And I welcome this. Of course, this year we are far from getting anywhere there. And let me very quickly thereof highlight to you also an emerging new problem, which has not been thought of before. And that is that while the federal government has run into a stage of the unsustainable finances, you're beginning to see the emergence of unsustainable finances at the provincial level. This quarter, our estimates are that the provinces will have a cash deficit of 400 billion rupees. And one of the reasons for that, no doubt, is the excessively optimistic estimation of growth in revenues and thereby in transfers. The shortfall in transfers this year to the provinces, as per the original budget targets, is going to be 840 billion rupees. Let me emphasize, 2% of the GDP. How then are we going to be spending on human development? That is why the need for tax reform at the provincial level also has acquired high priority. And this is where the state capture by the privileged is very, very pronounced. So how do we break out of this problem? I don't know. I don't see how, for example, the Punjab budget is going to end up declaring cash surplus, which is what the IMF expects next year, that we will have a surplus of 0.5% of the GDP generated by the provinces. Where is this surplus going to come from? It's not going to happen. You will end up with a deficit of close to 0.5% of the GDP. I'm sure Salman will be able to tell you much more about this problem, but this is a new problem. The NFC debate is superfluous because it's not that the provincial governments are rich and the federal government is poor. Both are poor today. And this is something which needs to be understood and realized. So there are these fundamental problems. Yeah.
What about your inflation target? What about your inflation target? Is 2 to 5%?
Well, the inflation target, the fund, for example, in its framework, talks of 8 to 5%, and not 2 to 5%. In the framework, they have said 8 to 5%. My own assessment is that there has to be scope for what I call seigniorage in the economy, which is monetary expansion, which caters to growth in money demand. To that extent, absolutely, totally, I am inclined to see the scope for some degree of financing through the central bank and not zero financing.
Okay.
The other option, of course, also is that we do have some expansionary financing, and that, of course, must go into productive channels so that there is some balance between demand and supply. However, my own thinking is that a proper, realistic inflation rate for Pakistan, which does provide some fiscal and monetary space for growth, is 7 to 8%. This is my own thinking, and the fund has opted for a lower rate for reasons of their concern for so-called stabilization.
Okay, thank you. Salman Saab, can you please tell us this thing about the inflation target and whether there should be a growth agency just like the central bank, or should we only aim for central bank independence? Should the finance ministry be managing everything under the sun? So why do we have other ministries?
Look, I think inflation is in this post-COVID-19 world is really not an issue in any country, let alone Pakistan. The issue is growth. And I think we don't need to worry about inflation. And I'm totally surprised that the fund is putting so much emphasis on targeting inflation in this environment. It seems that they don't know that what is happening on the ground. What is happening on the ground is that our services economy has been totally disrupted. Our manufacturing economy is almost 50% or more closed down. 20 to 30 million people are unemployed and living on handouts, and they are going to run out of any sort of income in another month or so. And we are talking about inflation. I think we need to really focus on a very major program of spending, and it has to come from debt. It cannot come from revenues. There's no way you are going to get revenues. And now debt financing is something which is a double-edged sword. If we can get these projects, which are long delayed projects, and if their economic rate of return is a lot larger than their cost of capital, at least we can raise our domestic debt by at least 5 to 6% of GDP and spend the money on this infrastructure programs. This is what will keep you going. And if you select good projects, if you select projects which do provide a return, which is asking a big, which is a big take from setup, then we may be able to weather this storm. But if we are going to go into an austerity mode, I'm afraid we are going to go into a very sharp downward spiral, and we won't be able to come out of it in the next 5 to 10 years. So I think the focus of debate has to be that our public sector development program has to be expanded. I mean, that you cannot cut it. Our tradition is if you have very big revenue targets, then you are not able to meet them, and you leave all these projects half finished. I mean, the throw forward in the development program, I would put emergency funding and finish all those projects. There should be zero throw forward, because this is the time to finish those projects if they have been properly designed and if they are going to give a rate of return, because the economy needs that.
Okay, thank you. Let me turn to my final question, folks. My final question is very simple, Pasha Salman. My final question is very simple. Do we negotiate the fund program? Do we develop a growth strategy? Do we do any research work in the fund? You put up so many things. Salman, you put up issues of value chain. You put up issues of investment. Pasha Saab, you put up so many things on agriculture, on fiscal, on these things. Who in the government is your interlocutor? Who is doing these calculations? The way I look at it, and correct me if I'm wrong, most governments have white papers, most government have policy papers, most government have bureaucracies that are doing research and putting out these things that we can target, talk about, discuss. Those people should be here on the webinar, and I can warrant you that today, I mean, I don't know if there's anybody from the government. If there's somebody from the government, please tell us. But I think, quite frankly, we don't have any. So please tell me on the capacity of the government to build policy and do things. And should we have this capacity? Should we just rely on the World Bank donors to do this policy? Pasha Saab, your take on this?
A very important question. There is no other option but to strengthen once again the Planning Commission. And now, following the 18th Amendment, have extremely strong planning and development departments or boards in the provinces. Without that, we are not going to be able to have a degree of innovation. And again, can I suggest with all due respects that we have always had this sense that the critical element in this within the federal government is in the role that can be played by institutions like the Pakistan Institute of Development Economics. I mean, you are, of course, at least partly being supported by government.
Yeah.
And we would be very, very keen to see, and I'm so happy that this role has started once again somewhat through the webinars and so on. I hope this will be sustained, and this kind of creative thinking, which we all totally subscribe to, can start taking place. Meanwhile, what the government has done is, I believe that the successor to the Economic Advisory Council, which was allowed to operate for less than a year, and then somehow or the other, it just hung up there to dry. The government has apparently constituted a think tank. Now, why is it that the key institutions of government, particularly outside the Ministry of Finance, are not part of this process? Why is it that there is such exclusion exerted by Finance Ministry? The more participation you have from civil society, from the key institutions of government, universities, and so on, the better will be the range of ideas that you will be able to generate. And different people have different areas of expertise. So my request is that this whole process of creative thinking for growth-led strategies has to be much more broad-based and transparent in character. With all due respects, the Ministry of Finance is not at all at a point where it can come up with this kind of thinking today.
Salman Saab, your take on this? Do you think we have the capacity? Should we build the capacity? How should we build the capacity? Why is it that
Nadeem,
there
one-
are policy papers coming from the government? Go ahead, G.
Yes, I think one thing is quite clear, that if you look at any indicator of governance, any international indicator of governance, whether it is productivity, competitiveness of the performance of your logistics systems, transport systems, your value chains, your education systems, your health systems, we are at the bottom of the world. Countries which were way behind us, countries like Vietnam, if you just look at their indicators and you look at Pakistan's indicators, it becomes very clear that there is a total collapse of governance in Pakistan and governance institutions. We have not kept up with the times at all. So I think this is not going to be an easy solution. This is something that you need to, maybe this COVID could be a kind of a changing point for us, that we'll have to change everything. Because if we don't change, we are not going to come out of this crisis in a good shape. So I think, yes, governance has to be totally revamped. Our civil service has to be revamped. Our private sector has to be revamped. Our schools, universities, the entire system has to be revamped. And the country has to be able to actually, this is a hackneyed term, but actually live up to its potential. And it has lots and lots of potential. So I think that we have to go back, and there may be major surgery is needed in this whole structure. We have almost every institution you can think of, but we don't have the people, we don't have the systems, we don't have the processes, we don't have the vision. We are not able to articulate a policy without the help of the donors or without any external help. So I think we have to generate all of this within in-house, and it will need a very major reform effort, and the nation has to start working on reforms. Unfortunately, reforms are the most difficult thing, and there are no champions for reforms. But I must say that the Prime Minister has indicated that this is the best time for reform, and do the reforms which we have not been able to do for many, many years. This is the time to do those reforms.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, both of you. I think we've had a great discussion, ladies and gentlemen. I've learned a lot, but I still think there are too many unanswered questions, too many issues that we need to think about. So let me open up the floor. I don't see any hands raised. If you want to raise your hand, raise it. Otherwise, just tell me and come in and let's have a...
Can I
Naseem Beg Saab, go ahead.
Several hands that are raised.
There are 79 hands raised, Nadeem Bhai.
Where? I don't see any. Maybe my mistake. I don't see
Farooq.
Okay. May I start?
Naseem Saab, you start. Naseem Saab, you start. Then we'll go ahead.
Heard a lot about growth. Haven't heard anything about poverty, social development. Are we going to depend entirely on trickle down? That's my question.
Okay, good. So we'll collect some questions and come back to the panel. Okay. Next question. Amir Durrani, you want to ask a question? Amir Durrani.
No, sir. I have a question, but later. I want you to.
Okay, later.
Farooq
Saab, go ahead.
Can I ask, I can't show my hand, I can't
Farooq
see.
Saab, go ahead. Farooq Saab, go ahead.
Dr. Salman Shah and Dr. Pasha Saab, being a soldier, my question will be very undiplomatic. And I confess that I don't know anything about economy. My question is that since the very beginning, the Planning Commission, Ministry of Finance has been run by the specialists trained abroad, and they are the galaxy from Ahmed to Mahbub al-Haq to Pasha Saab and to Salman Shah Saab, etc., etc. The webinars I've attended, in every webinar, there have been, the basic one point everyone cribbed that nothing is right in this country. While they were part of the government and the planning in one time or the other. It looks as if some aliens have been running this country and all these experts were helpless. Me and Salman Shah Saab were part of the team. He involved me in managing a little bit of the developmental assistance we had given to Afghanistan. So he knows me. So my question is, why have they failed this country? Thank you.
Well, Nadeem, can I answer that?
The question that will be more efficient. Okay? Let me just collect the question.
Nadeem Saab, can I ask a question?
कौन बोल रहे हैं? Talat Anwar.
Talat
Go ahead.
Thank you very much. I have a question on the power sector reform, which Pasha Saab highlighted, And I think for power sector reform, we need to review the power purchase agreement and the power sector agreement. Without review, we cannot reduce the losses since we have guaranteed high return on equity and along with the higher power purchase rates and the capacity payment. So until and unless we, review and revise the power sector rate, because the problem in the power sector is that, our tariff rates are set below the cost recovery level. There is always a gap, and government has to provide the subsidy for that gap. And as a result, we have circular debt. So I think for power sector reform, the fundamental thing that the government need to do is to review and revise the power sector agreement. And without, I think, revision, we cannot do anything. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Shahid Kardar, you want to ask anything?
I was just more keen to revise that just to go back to bed. It is our problem, right? So I have no quarrel with the IMF because I have yet to see in the last 30 odd years any internally consistent, credible macroeconomic action plan. I keep hearing we need to run fiscal deficits. I mean, we're going to run fiscal deficits. Do we know what the impact will be on the current account? So unless I see that, and we all know it's a long haul. Let's first be clear. We haven't done anything for the last 30 odd years. I know we're all lamenting, but it's now a much longer haul. And because we always looked at it, always looked at this problem as a financing problem. We have been looking towards the fund to finance the issue. Never were we looking at it from the point of view of the structural side or where we were running into these kinds of problems. We were lucky. We had first the Cold War, then the Afghan War, then 9/11, then war against terror and so on and so forth. So we've been lucky. Something came along and we were quite happy struggling along at low rates of growth while the rest our neighbors, were hurtling. And so I still have failed to see where that credible plan is going to come from, because it is our problem. I have no problem frankly, with the fund. The fund will think in terms of 3 years. We all know this problem is not going to be solved in 3 years. That's the reality. The fund program can never be more than 3 years. This problem of 35 years has to be resolved. Maybe the solution is that all these donors walk away and we will start looking after ourselves in a way. Okay. Financing, I repeat, is not an issue. If you have a good plan, isn't that what the private sector does? When it tries to raise money from a bank, it is based on a credible operational plan that the bank comes in and finances. It should apply, the same principles apply to a country. Do you have a credible plan? Thank you.
Do we have a plan or not? Good point. Good point. Naseem Zara.
Gee, thank you. This is fascinating. Obviously, very critical issues. A lot of issues have been discussed multiple times before. My question would be to Salman Shah Saab. He just said that this government, I mean, I'm really wanting us to look forward and see, based on what all you people have just said, and this is terrific, being part of this. The question is, are we in any better position now with reference to what Shahid Kardar just said in terms of getting somewhere from here? Are we thinking, this growth-led approach when Salman Shah Saab says this Prime Minister saying, yes, we should do it and he has the vision? Can Salman Shah Saab elaborate on what are the specifics that we are seeing that assure us that this is going to happen, that we are going to see some change compared to the last 30 years? Because Nadeem, as you've just mentioned, the issues are that the policy makers don't have the input from institutions that are relevant, etc. And we have 2 years of this government. Does Salman Shah Saab have the confidence that this government is drawing on the kind of brain power that we are seeing in this webinar? I mean, is there any hope, or is this just going to be more talk?
Okay, thanks. Let the speakers answer the first round of questions, then we'll take another round of questions. So Pasha Saab, go ahead.
Yes, indeed. One of the fundamental points behind pursuing a growth strategy is that it has to be, almost by definition, an inclusive growth strategy. And in fact, in some ways, it may act as a positive source of growth, particularly from the viewpoint of creating a sense of participation and, more importantly, perhaps even stimulating demand and thereby leading to more growth. So there is no trade-off between growth and inclusiveness in that sense. And that is why towards the end of this morning's discussion and our presentations by Salman and myself, we had begun to focus on issues of labor productivity, absorption of the youth, and the need to focus particularly on the right strategy in terms of both the level and the composition of our human development effort. That, I think, is central to this whole link between growth and poverty. The point raised by the military general as to why people like us, who are, of course, specialists and have been educated elsewhere in the world, We have been at various times part of the process of government, and why is it that there has been very little change brought in by us? Let me, with all honesty, also be frank like he was. There's one fundamental reason. We are subsidiary to the whole process of power structure in this country. And I know by which you will understand what I'm referring to without having to be explicit. You come up with a radical proposal, for example, I've been arguing for the last many years since 1997 that why is it that the rate on Abiana water charge, which is the most important price today because we have a huge shortage of irrigation water, why is it that it recovers only 8% of the operations and maintenance cost? Why can't we raise it? It's a very simple, logical response. I'm sure people like us who had some education abroad may have suggested this, but why doesn't it get done? Why doesn't it get implemented? I'm sure the general has the answer to that. Turning to the power purchase agreement issue, yes, indeed. And you see, the point is, we have to be, of course, we are told careful about international purchase agreements, which we may have with some foreign IPPs. But why can we not renegotiate with our local IPPs? And ensure, for example, do you know that over the last, since 1994, over the last 26 years or so, the tax relief given to the IPPs adds up to a cool 1,500 billion rupees. I mean, you give tax incentives for 5 years or so. These are tax holidays, they're legitimate. And then now we have gone ahead and given our Chinese plants, with the construction plants particularly and so on, 23-year income tax exemptions. So even the new plants are beginning to enjoy the same facility. Finally, on this issue of macroeconomic plan coming out, I think the time has come when civil society and institutions of a public nature, including our premier research institutions like PIDE, maybe we should come up with such a macroeconomic plan, even if it is not possible for government to do so. Let's throw in the best of our expertise and our years of experience working in our beloved country and do such a plan. I'm willing to sit for N hours to help preparation of a macroeconomic plan outside government. And hopefully this will be picked up by the media and we can start a meaningful debate on this issue. I look forward to PIDE's lead on this particular.
We will do that, Pasha. We will do that. We will do that. Absolutely. Shah Saab, what's your response?
Nadeem, I think Pasha has more or less taken care of most of the issues, but let me take the last point raised by Naseem Zara. You know, I think number one, the reason why we are never able to do anything is that there is no continuity in policies. There's always a switching of policies which happens all the time. New governments come in, they have their own agendas and they start working on that. But in context of what I said, the Prime Minister said specifically that all difficult choices which has to be made, we can make them. And this is the time to try and get the old dead wood out of the system and get things moving, make the institutions work. All the reforms which you need, he will support. But it's not that easy. It cannot just be done by just a statement. You have to develop strategies for this. And I would say that as Hafiz talked about a macroeconomic plan, I would say that we need also a plan at the micro level for competitiveness. How do we create the competitive advantage for Pakistan? and Pakistan can have a competitive advantage in many, many areas. And those obviously have to do with our institutions, with our governance, with our policies, how we set up and how we regulate things. And so there can be that kind of approach, which is also needed. And it's not going to be easy because our institutions, unfortunately, are quite fossilized, and some are good, some are very bad, and there are very, very many weak links in the entire chain. So I think we all have to work hard, and maybe this event will start changing things, because if we don't change, I don't think we'll be able to make it.
Okay. We'll do that too, Shah Sahab. We'll take you up on that. Okay, ji. Next round, Irfan Aleem Sahab.
Yeah, I don't know how to raise hands, Nadeem. At some point in time, can I speak? This is Musaddiq.
Sure.
Later on, whenever you find appropriate.
We'll take you in. Okay. Go ahead, Irfan Aleem Sahab.
Assalamu alaikum. I hope you can all hear me.
We can hear you fine.
Okay. First of all, thanks to Nadeem for organizing this exceptionally interesting series, and also to Hafiz Pasha and Salman Shah for their excellent presentations. I think it's very difficult to disagree with many of the key points they have made, touching the holy cows, whether on policy and institutional reform, whether it's on fiscal side, whether it's on the human development. But what I want to raise fundamentally is the question whether we are right in saying that the World Bank and the IMF have not been focusing on growth. And is it possible that the problem is with us, that we have been focusing, the priorities we've been focusing on are the ones that we have been focused on. I mean, most of the discussion over here, a large part of the discussion has been on the fiscal side. Now, let me give you specifics. In the IMF's last program, which I'm sure many of you have read, there is a very clear assumption that exports will increase by 50% in value terms between 2019 and 2022. And that essentially helps the growth rate to raise to 5%. So to say that the IMF is not been talking about growth is really questionable. I also attended a presentation by the lead economist for the World Bank in Masood's organization in CGE at the World Bank. And there is very clear that in his main report on this, Pakistan at 100, his essential, he talks about growth rate going to 6 to 8%, which was what has happened in this. He underlying assumption was that exports would increase fivefold. So to say that they have not been talking about this is really questionable. Now, there may be the assumptions they made are questionable. Maybe I believe they are questionable about just that you can reduce tariffs and get the exchange right and work. Now that's another thing. But let's look at ourselves. What have we done? Our focus is not on exports. Our focus is on, the question arises, for example, that Bangladesh, which has, as I understand, you can correct me, has a fiscal deficit about not fiscal deficit, but a tax to GDP ratio not very different from ours, but their exports are at least twice higher than ours. But we ignore that. Similarly, there is an issue of deregulation that Shah Sahab was talking about. Yes, but why don't we focus on what is needed to enhance exports? So I'm just the basic point. I question the point. That the institutions, the IMF and the World Bank have not been focusing on growth.
No, it's not a big. I think you got the wrong impression, but doesn't matter. I'll let the panel answer. It's not that IMF, World Bank. We're just taking the fund program. We're going with one thing only, the fund program. And the fund program, just because it says exports are high, doesn't mean anything. Exports cannot grow because I wish them to grow. Exports are not growing because the government wants to. Government has a target of exports of 50% every year. Doesn't mean anything. It doesn't matter. Let's go to somebody from Pisces, South Africa had a question. Do you want to ask a question or not? Are you there? 19T 452. Who is that?
Nadeem Saab.
Ji.
I'm afraid that I can't raise my hand. So whenever
ये
possible, I'd
कौन
like
सा
to ask a question.
कौन सा है?
This is
कौन-
Ajwad Imran.
Okay, ठीक है जी. Okay, Musaddiq Malik, then you go ahead. Senator Musaddiq Malik.
ओके सर जी सर, थैंक यू वेरी मच. आपने बड़े अहम सवाल उठाया था फंडिंग का.
मुसद्दिक साहब अंग्रेजी में रहे. Just stay in अंग्रेजी because there's some issue. ठीक.
Terribly sorry, not my
problem.
language, but I'll try anyway.
Doesn't matter.
So what I'm saying is that I think you you raised an interesting point at the beginning about private sector funding, and then Salman Shah Sahab also raised a very interesting point where he said that at this point in time, if we don't do the large infrastructure projects, we'd be amiss. Now, the question is that if most of the local borrowing, and he mentioned specifically local borrowing, if most of the local borrowing from the banks is done by the public sector for infrastructure projects, then the SME funding or other private sector funding obviously would constrict. And if the big problem in growth is private sector funding, then how is the government going to get out of the way of the private sector? And also, Salman Shah Sahab raised some very interesting points about PM saying that we are willing to make the difficult choices. If you could help us what those difficult specific choices are, because largely I understand the reform idea, but what specific reform are we talking about around which they're willing to make the difficult choices in this budget that is forthcoming? And finally, a little bit on the demand side. We've said a lot about the supply side, that we make the funding available. And I think Pasha Saab mentioned about financing for housing. That was the demand side intervention. Is there any other demand side intervention which would make the demand stronger and more sophisticated?
Okay, fair enough. Can we have Nisar Mehman Saab?
Yeah, thank you very much, Nadeem. I think my question was very specific, is that we are talking about the political will, Hafiz Pasha talked about, and also Salman Shah talked about it, is the decision that have been taken. I think one of the things is that in decision making, the government and there is also the opposition, and there's a parliament. Now, I'm happy that Musaddiq Malik is there, and he should have talked about how he is going to and his party is going to influence this budget, because they are all in the standing committees and the budget is come in there, and they must also support the idea of PIDE, presenting a plan and a microeconomic framework. Then they take over, because I think unless we move the parliament, who are part of decision makers, and whether it is Abhyana, whether it is anything we talk about in the budget, I think we will be really talking amongst ourselves enough. Then my last question is, who, I would like to ask the panelists who are so brilliantly they presented everything, and they also given the solutions. So what are the reforms specifically that are there? Now, who in their opinion is driving the economy? Is it IMF or the government? Because I heard different approaches. One, if it is government, then who in the government is really driving and working together? Because I think this is a big dilemma with this particular situation in this current. We have seen this in COVID-19 also. Provinces are going one way, the government is another way. So I'd like to know how they see the government in terms of the economy. Thank you.
Jokio Saab, did you have a question? Jokio Saab?
Nadeem, I also ask. Nadeem Saab?
I'll come to you. ये अवध साहब अभी कौन बोल रहे थे जी? Can you ask a question?
Yes, that was me. Thank you. My first question has to do with the tax to GDP. I understand that the government should be more proactive in collecting taxes, but I'm curious if you, the panelists, think that whether there are any benefits of a low tax to GDP ratio that are accruing to the society in the form of higher consumption and savings, thereby driving the GDP of Pakistan. That's my first question. And my second question is that as the corona crisis continues to unravel, what scope do we see for the Central Bank of Pakistan to undertake a more expansionary approach? In the US, we're seeing the Fed, obviously they've continued the policy of quantitative easing for some time, and this time around, as you know, they're directly buying the bonds of the companies. So given the fact that the private sector hasn't really been pulling its weight, can we foresee the state bank to step in? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, Amir Durrani, go ahead.
So thank you very much. Two questions actually. One is specifically to Pasha Saab, and the other one. So the Pasha Saab mentioned something very nice, but in a way he said NFC is superfluous. My question to him is that could this, what you call a superfluous debate, actually be very important this time because of the same reason that you're highlighting the absence of the revenue effort both at the local level and at the provincial level, because eventually that's this is the forum, and I know it's not part of the TUR of the NFC, but what do you have to say about that? My second question, which is probably to both, is really, given this is our third in our series of discussion, which have been very interesting. Who is running the economy? Sort of what the gentleman before me asked, but here I want you to specifically let me know. We had in the development circles, we often say, there are two conflicting points of view. One says that, let 1,000 flowers bloom, and yet the other say, no, there should be a unified strategy. I really would like you both, Salman Saab and you, to tell me, and I'll give you a specific example to think about. Just last Ramadan, the DC of Islamabad set up and intervened in the market. And how did he do that? He simply hired 2 startup incubators to run an app called Mandi. Now, when on one hand we say, and this distorted the effort of a lot of youngsters, including my kids and the kids next door, who were trying to do this. And he selected these 2 people, and basically it became a rent-seeking opportunity. So I don't know if there is a cohesive effort which keeps track of all tiers of government that I can understand somebody's thinking fiscal at the macro level, at government, at the federation level, but where massive entrepreneurship takes place and where skills matter are cities. And here, why is the DMG and people interfering, and why does the state not have a plan overall? Thank you.
Chalanji, we'll take another last round of questions after this. So Salman and Pasha, can you go and answer these questions and take the last round? Go ahead, Pasha.
Okay. I'll, as before, try and answer them in sequence. And to be very honest, we are all still very human and beginning to get tired, because the questions are indeed some very leading and extremely important and useful questions. The first is this: is there a wrong perception that the IMF is pursuing, in fact, implicitly, perhaps not so explicitly, a strategy which is pro-growth by talking in terms of export growth? You see, the tragedy is that in order to achieve even a semblance of export growth and so on, we need investment, innovation, and technology improvements. You look at the IMF's projection of the investment level of Pakistan over the next 5 years, it moves up dramatically from 13% to 15%. There is no way this country will be able to get to a higher growth rate with investment rates stuck at 13 to 15%. They have not given any space for higher investment, especially in the investment in infrastructure. The level of development spending remains in the range of 3 to 3.5% of the GDP. And about 15 to 20 years ago, we used to manage over 6% of the GDP. And it's very interesting. Let me quickly tell you the hierarchy of expenditures in Pakistan. Way back, about 20 years ago, it used to be development first, defense second, and then debt servicing. Today, you have a situation with unambiguously debt servicing is the first, then comes defense, and development is a very, very poor third. Development spending has been curtailed massively. So there is no clear indication, with all due respects to the IMF, of a pro-growth strategy. And as the moderator said, we need to know how exports will grow. What will be the mechanisms and strategies for achieving export-led growth? Now, on the questions raised by Musaddiq Malik Saab, he's talked I think very, very, very importantly, about the crowding out phenomena in the banking system. Quite frankly, Malik Saab, what you have is a subtle mechanism of, if I may use the expression, underhand open market operations by the state bank with the commercial banks, whereby money is fed into the banking system, and that money is then used to buy government treasury bills or investment bonds by the banking system. On paper, therefore, the crowding out phenomena should not be so marked. The problem is on the demand side of credit. We over the last 2 years, we were operating interest rates in the range of 13% or more. And at a time when the economy needs to take off, we managed to keep these interest rates very high. And it's only after COVID that the state bank suddenly realized the need for somewhat more monetary expansion policy and brought down the interest rates by 5 percentage points or slightly less than more than that. But yet the interest rates remain relatively high. It's not a crowding out phenomena as much as a demand side problem with credit. On the issue of political will, with all due respects, those of us whose life has been spent in hoping for a social democratic system in Pakistan, I must say we remain disappointed because at this time in Pakistan's history, if all political parties do not get together like they did once before for the National Action Plan Against Terrorism, and that indeed was a phenomenal success, and all credit to the army for having done a stellar job. Why is it that at this time when we all know, and Salman and I have tried to emphasize the gravity of the problem created by COVID, why is it that we do not have the beginnings of a national consensus on the kind of a rehabilitation and revival plan that Pakistan needs to follow? On the question of who's driving the economy, let me say that my own experience, I've had to deal with the fund 3 times. I've negotiated with them, sometimes even when I was outside the government. I was called in to help in the negotiations. I must say that there have been times when we made solid technical arguments. We found that the fund was willing to listen. The governments have to be more aggressive in coming up with creative ideas. And if they can begin to satisfy the IMF that there is a degree of consistency, likelihood of success, implementation capacity, then there is, I think, space for a joint effort in the design of a fund program, provided our side presents the necessary technical expertise and ideas. And that is why I feel this new macroeconomic plan that PIDE will be working on with our assistance should begin to provide an alternative. The very interesting question asked by Mr. Jokyo on if the tax to GDP ratio is low, what happens? Does this get transmitted into savings or consumption? Pakistan's experience is that certainly over the last 7-8 years, much of the growth has been in private consumption. It has been essentially very much a consumption-led growth. So there are, unfortunately, what we are not seeing is a transmission from tax breaks to higher savings. And that is indeed one area which we need to focus on. On the state bank's expansionary policy, the state bank has taken a few steps forward in terms of coming up with various packages for maintaining employment, for promoting hospitals and others to invest in necessary equipment, so on. They've come up with some new ideas, but with all due respect, I do not see any success yet in implementation. I mentioned earlier that after something like more than 4 weeks of announcing of these packages, why is private sector credit down, not up, by 44 billion rupees? Finally, on NFC, yes, you know, if you don't mind, we can begin to learn from a neighboring country which has had 16 now awards, actual awards. We are now in the 10th, but we've had hardly 5 awards. There is a need to induce an incentive within the formula for fiscal effort. Has to be a link between the additional revenue generated and the share in the transfer, so that the provinces in particular, who with all due respects, even after the handing over of the sales tax and services, have not been able to take the tax to GDP ratio beyond just 1% of the GDP, then I think what you will begin to see is some kind of an incentive framework which also leads to development of subnational taxes. And finally, who is running the economy? I think we begin to answer the question, and I hope to God that one day, inshallah, Pakistan will be able to run its own economy more effectively. Thank you.
Shah Saab, your answers?
Gee, I think one of the benefits of speaking after Hafiz is that he answers all the questions, and so you have a very easy time tackling these things. So I'll just take up 2 points. One is that I think the banking system has plenty of liquidity. As Pasha mentioned, the demand side is the issue. But in our particular case, the central bank would have to play a role in trying to get the banks out of their traditional comfort zones and move into things like infrastructure finance, housing finance, or SME finance, not on paper only, but in practice as well. So they have to be really focused on trying to play their role in the revival of the economy and play a role in the development of the economy. The other point is that, which Naseem mentioned and which Musaddiq Saab also pointed out, what are we talking about when we say difficult decisions? I think one of the major decisions as far as the province is concerned is that how do you make our organizations more effective? We have, for example, in the rural economy, we have lots of research institutions about various crops, about water, about other things, but their output is negligible. Their kind of support to the rural economy is negligible, even though we have hundreds and hundreds of PhDs working on seed or on processes. The whole thing is not coming into the marketplace. So how to increase that organizational effectiveness, because they have been tied up in red tape, in systems, procedures which are very, very ancient and which need to be changed. Proper incentives have to be created, professionalism, etc., etc. So it's a tough task, and but it can be done. It has to be done if we have to provide some kind of a catalyst role in the revival of the economy, particularly the rural economy. And on the urban side, we have lots and lots of issues about urbanization and how urbanization is being managed, how development in the cities is being managed, how cities will be regenerated, what kind of bazaars, wholesale markets, retail markets, what kind of infrastructure is needed, and basically what is restraining everything. I think that is the real question. The question is not who is running the economy. The question is who is restraining the economy. And we know that the restraining factors are from the IMF right down to the lack of reforms, lack of commitment, lack of political kind of harmony in terms of economics.
Okay, thanks a lot, Shah Saab. Okay, folks, final round, because we can't keep going on. I know lots of people want to ask questions, so let's get the final questions in. Shakil Ahmed, our long lost friend, Thailand. Go ahead.
Thank you, Nadeem sir. It's such a pleasure to be to be listening to Pasha Saab and Salman Saab. I have just a simple question, and basically I would maybe building on what Dr. Pasha Saab said, that we need to have a macroeconomic plan and all those things. But I was just wondering whether we have the issue of plans or we have the issue of implementation. Because I mean, in my own experience, whenever there is a new government, they come up with their own plan, and somehow the plan kind of just it ends up on the shelves and no one implemented, and we know that what are some of the issues over there. And this I would like to link what Salman Shah Saab said, was this consistency and policy. And that brings me to the second question, is that how can that be done? Because we know the political governments would have always for 5 years. The only kind of, if we kind of try to link continuity with the continuity of the governments, then perhaps the only continuity or a kind of a long-term continuity is brought by the military governments. So in this kind of a situation, how can we ensure that whatever we plan is implemented over a longer period of time? Thank you.
Okay, ji. Amna Khan. Amna Khan.
Yes. Hello. Thank you for acknowledging me. Thank you for these informative session. I have a couple of questions. I have like 2 questions. Salman sir mentioned rural development. I need to bring forward this rural support program, Al Khan Rural Support Program. I had the privilege of interning there actually last year. So it was sort of a holistic kind of a model that we can replicate in other provinces for rural support. It involved grassroots level changes, social mobilization, community involvement, because we can't replicate models which are basically in USA or Pakistan or other UAE countries. We need a specific model which caters to development in Pakistan, which is basically which I think our Rural Support Program in Skardu and Gilgit-Baltistan basically is doing a great job. Secondly, I want to emphasize on what Pasha Saab said earlier about developing the youth, strengthening the vulnerable communities basically, and human development, providing employment opportunities, creating jobs for youth, so that and thirdly, skill development programs. What do you think about those? Are vocational training programs, should they be part of the growth strategy that you are sort of suggesting, which should be a part of the next IMF program? Thank you.
Okay. Can we have Mahmood Khalid?
Nadeem, I have to move on to a new meeting. Hopefully we'll meet again.
Whose mic is on here? Mahmood Khalid, are you saying something or not? Okay, then we move on. Then we go to Idris Khaja.
Sir, both Dr. Salman and Dr. Pasha talked about being plenty of liquidity in the banking system and the crowding out, etc. But my fear is that despite the monetary easing, credit may not grow because of the institutional constraints, like lack of collateral, like weak titles, and there being unending litigation if the borrower refuses to pay. Secondly, our SME is not tuned to borrow. We just lend only to the large-scale sectors. So unless these constraints are addressed, credit may not grow at all.
Fair point. Shahid Mahmood? Not there? Okay.
Sir, I'm here. I'm here.
Okay, go ahead quickly.
May I quickly, sir, my question, it's actually 3 parts, but very brief parts. The first part is, has anybody ever thought about why people refuse paying taxes? So we keep hearing this, and every prime minister that comes says that people are tax thieves. So people are not born as thieves. So if there is tax theft, why is there tax theft? Has anybody ever thought about the broken trust between people and the government, and why is it so? Okay. Okay. The second part, the brief one, and the last one, I won't go further. What's the guarantee that if tax income or total income of the government is equal to its expenditure, it becomes equal to its expenditure, which is about 9 trillion or a bit more, then the expenditures won't gallop to 11 or 12 trillion. What's the guarantee? I mean, they keep asking people about taxes, paying taxes, but what about expenses? Where is the efficiency of expenditures, efficiency in investment, the marginal efficiency of capital?
Good question. Good question. Good questions. Manzoor Saab, do you want to ask anything? Manzoor Saab, is he gone or is he here? I think he's gone. Okay. Shahid Kardar, do you still want to ask a question? Another question? Or
I'm here. Two, three things.
Okay.
Because I keep hearing words like credit and so on. And we talked about investment of the private sector. I think one of the things we take very lightly is predictability of government policy. If government policy can't be predicted, I'd be reluctant to invest. So I'll be looking at more speculative activity. So let's not forget that part. So the second point is I keep hearing this reference to, Asha, I know has mentioned the expenditure side, the tax to GDP ratio. I won't go into details on it, but let's remind ourselves. There is a huge issue called the losses of the state-owned enterprise. Because we don't have an accrual system, no one knows. No one knows how big the hole is, frankly. The only hole that Asha picked up was what is being reflected in the budget. None of us knows, frankly, how big the hole is. And finally, this whole business of what should be lent to the private sector or not, apart from predictability, really is a very simple question. If, as a banker, my main borrower is the government, sovereign borrower, there is a sovereign bank picking up anything that I can throw at him, why the hell would I not be relaxed in my approach? There is no need to make any effort. There is someone from Islamabad is like,
don't worry, we're going to have a banking seminar.
Asking for money as a voracious appetite.
Right. Manzoor, I thought I heard you. Are you there? Manzoor Saab, did I hear you or am I wrong? Anybody else? Very quickly.
Dr. Nadeem Saab, you want me to ask? Okay, can you hear me? Yeah. Two points. One, I think several people raised about IMF, and Dr. Pasha said that perhaps we are not well prepared for negotiations. We have had, this is the 13th program last 30 years, but this time, strangely, IMF asked for 45% raise in taxes the first year. This year, they're asking 30%. And I'm sure they would know that there's no such capacity. And okay, my second question is about this power policy. Some people suggested renegotiating. That may not be easy, but what we can do is what India has done. They passed an environmental law that plants more than 25 years old they don't meet. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, I'll go back to the panel. Pasha, would you like to answer some of these questions?
There are some questions specially referred to Salman, and I'm sure he'll do justice to them.
Okay. Fair enough.
A very fundamental question raised by Shakil Ahmed, which is that is there really a problem of the design and the quality of creativity in the macroeconomic plans, or is it really an implementation problem? You see, one of the things about macroeconomic planning is that while we do want to be creative, particularly in terms of trying to develop a growth strategy, we do need to be in the realm of realism. And that is indeed important, because what usually happens is whenever we prepare plans, we tend to become very ambitious in terms of the targets. So implementation is a function, in a sense, of the targets. And if the targets are really quite unrealistic and excessive, then clearly implementation is going to falter. Yes, there is a need for more refinement of implementation capacity. And particularly, already Salman has referred to the quality of our civil service and how we need to make it somewhat more oriented towards planning and other issues. On this issue of continuity, military governments versus civil governments, interestingly, we have had a period since 2008 where we have had continuity and we have had a peaceful transition of power twice. So I would suggest that we hopefully can maintain this tradition of letting governments complete their tenures, take full responsibility during the tenures, hopefully come up with a well-defined manifesto which translates into a pragmatic agenda and leads to a plan. Then, of course, we would begin to see somewhat more of a process of growth-led planning and strategy. On the development of youth and skill development, indeed, and may I suggest that in the interim period, one of the things we may need to do as a kind of a social protection measure is, again, if you don't mind my referring to the experience of a neighboring country, start a small youth employment guarantee program, particularly for those who have developed certain skills. And this needs to be done through the local system that is there in Pakistan. Okay, now let me turn to the very important issues raised by Shahid Mahmood Saab, which is the issue of supporting SMEs and so on. This was also raised by Khalid Saab. The issue is really this risk aversion on the part of the banking system and the high cost of transactions as they deal with SMEs. In fact, way back in the late 90s, I had brought in a special provision in the income tax law whereby any written off loan which had gone SAR to the extent of 2% or so of total credit, they allowed that to be written off in the income tax returns. So that much we have already done. Hopefully we may have to do more. But the point is that we have to, whether we like it or not, we have to diversify the credit. We have to talk about infrastructure, housing, SMEs, and so on. So I would suggest that we might wish to look at the recent Sri Lankan experience with how they have changed their legal structure and their incentive mechanisms for moving towards much larger financing of SMEs. The other issue raised by Shahid Mahmood Saab is one of galloping expenditures as to what is likely to happen. You raise the tax to GDP ratio, the expenditure rises. If you raise it by 1%, the expenditure rises by more than 1%. I mean, this is clearly an issue of fiscal management. You see, the problem, with all due respects, is that the role of Parliament is central to the budgetary process. And do you know that for reasons which I'm not at all clear on, why even taxation proposals, which are simply in the nature of taxation proposals yet from different constituencies, are not discussed in the Finance Committee of the National Assembly? This is an extremely important committee. They should be there to give the views of the various parties on different proposals that have come forward prior to the presentation in the budget. There is very little involvement of the parliamentary process in the actual drafting and preparation of budgets. And this has to change over time. And hopefully this will tend to bring in some measure of fiscal discipline. Shahid Qadar has raised a very important point. I mean, for example, look at the export sector. It has been subjected to such low environment in terms of changing policies. Sometimes we bring in a zero rating, then we withdraw zero rating, we change the policy on refunds, we bring back the policy on refunds, the financing percentages keep changing frequently, the pricing on energy keeps changing frequently, there's a lot of controversy. Clearly, at least please, for the export sector, which is our lifeline, please, for God's sake, have a set of policies which are there at least for 5 years, so that the export sector can receive more and more investment. Finally, and I must say I'm exhausted because the question's very excellent, the losses of state enterprises. Do you know that there used to be a publication called Annual Report on State-Owned Enterprises, which covered the roughly 300 to 400 even small enterprises that we have. And this was a beautiful report which used to summarize the financial position of the state enterprises. The last time this report was allowed to be brought out was 2015-16. This should have been an annual report, as was in the case in the past. And my request and plea would be, please, the Ministry of Finance, start bringing out this report annually on state-owned enterprises. And finally, let me conclude by thanking the moderator for his super job. And also, please, let's work together as civil society and as research institutions on developing a macroeconomic plan. Thank you all very much.
Shah, your responses? Shah, before you do that, can I quickly take one question from Irfan Aleem? Irfan Aleem sent me a message. Irfan, go ahead quickly. Very quickly, we're at the end of the discussion.
Thank you very much. Again, my brief question is that there has been an emphasis on 2 or 3 areas. I mean, the question is really, what are the 2 or 3 priorities on which the government should focus on? And the 2 of the areas that were mentioned were construction and agriculture. Now, the problem I have with them is that it's fine that it may help growth overall, but the impact will be reduced because the productivity in both these sectors is very low. I've been looking at the numbers here in Qatar, for instance, and that is something I would like to understand. Why is the emphasis on focusing on low productivity activities when you, Nadeem, have been focusing rightly on raising the overall productivity in the country?
Okay, thanks. Shah Saab, go ahead. Can you answer this too included? Salman Shah?
Dr. Nadeem, Salman Shah have left for meeting. Yes.
Oh, okay. Okay, folks. Then I think we shall just call it a halt here. Let me just say very briefly, I thank both my speakers. I thank the audience for some very good questions. Let me end by saying very briefly, the more I look at things, the more I see that we know very little about the economy. And this business about saying that we have plans and we don't implement them, I don't buy that at all, because quite frankly, we have no plans. When I go to the ministry, any ministry's website, there are no policies, no plans. I don't see any updating. I don't see any reports. For example, Pasha is right. We used to have the public sector sponsored corporations. We don't have them. We used to have an education report from a ministry, education ministry. We don't have it. We have nothing of any consequence. Yes, for example, Pasha Sahab, you'll be very happy to hear when the COVID crisis came up, the UNDP was commissioned by the Planning Commission to prepare its plan. So the UNDP is preparing a plan which I have read and commented on, and I must confess it was not a great plan, but it's still going through. Nobody's ever going to read it. Nobody's ever going to look at it, and the UNDP is then going to tell us we've got a plan. We don't have a plan because we haven't owned it, we haven't created it, we haven't discussed it, we haven't debated it. So just creating extra documentation doesn't mean we have anything. Just like the fund letter of intent, nobody reads it but you and me, and it's imposed in the country. So I think we need a much deeper discussion on these things. And Pasha, you're right, civil society must come together, and that's why we are doing it. Now, the issue of democracy, I think everybody expects too much of democracy. We had a webinar on democracy where we invited some very, very leading thinkers like Wasim Sajjad, Irfan Qadir, etc. And there the conclusion was that a democracy too is flawed. For example, the 14th Amendment has virtually made it impossible to debate the budget, because now the budget passes without any reason for a debate. They have a budget debate, PIDE has estimated for less than 10 hours. And that's it, it's gone. So, and the Ministry of Finance knows it, that the budget debate is absolutely meaningless. They have this motion, what is it, cut motion or something, and they kill the budget and there's no debate. So our democracy also needs reconfiguring, and we must begin to think about how we reconfigure our democracy. And I think, quite frankly, we have not devoted resources to it. The moment you mention democracy, people think you're talking about switching the constitution or changing the constitution. Nobody's saying that. But every law, every constitution needs updating over time. And I think we too need updating in terms of our voting systems, in terms of our procedures, in terms of things. Nobody's talking about changing the constitution, but making it more adaptable to our needs. And that's something that we discussed in that webinar, and we are going to print it out again. So thank you very much, folks. We'll continue the discussion on Saturday. We're going to have a financial market seminar. Thanks to Naseem Beg Saab, who's helped us organize it. So we'll return to our financial markets theme. We're going to keep returning to these themes because we need a lot to learn. And that's how we hope to bring civil service society together. Pasha, your offer is very kind, very commendable. We shall take you up on that. Thank you, folks. All the best. My gratitude to everybody. Join us Saturday again for another webinar. Bye-bye.